We are focused in this presentation and in this work on community solar, which we wanted to make sure we had a fairly standard definition of before we gathered data on projects and subscription structures. So essentially what we are defining as community solar is looking at ways that multiple customers or subscribers are purchasing output from a single PV array. The purpose of community solar is often to extend access to customers who could not adopt solar for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're renters, have a shaded roof, or are a low-income customer without access to finance a system on their own property. This work is part of a 3-year data collection and analysis effort funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. We are working with University of Minnesota as well as the Smart Electric Power Alliance last year. And we've gathered data from public filings, websites, government websites, and industry collaborators. So the data that we're presenting are on projects and subscription structures that we define as community solar. We know that definition is a little bit vague sometimes, or sometimes it's hard to tell, you know, is this community solar, is it not, is it something else? How do we figure this out? So we're looking at projects with 3 key criteria. One is financial benefits. So this means that the subscribers essentially are getting some type of credit on their bill, some way that they're being compensated for the investment that they're making in community solar. The second criteria is that folks who are subscribing in the project really are exclusive. So this is that there are subscribers within our utility service territory or maybe within a couple local counties. And the last criteria is that the subscription is discretionary. So you do have people opting in to purchase community solar. They may be making payments on a monthly basis or upfront payments, but they are making that choice to subscribe to the product. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric O'Shaughnessy to summarize some of our data on market status. Eric, why don't you just introduce yourself quickly and take it from here?
Sure. My name is Eric O'Shaughnessy. I am an independent consultant working for a variety of, or a couple labs, including NREL. Go ahead and I focus mostly on distributed solar markets with some work on community solar and voluntary green power markets. I need to get to. So I'm going to talk about the market status, give a high level overview of where we are today, some of the really big picture numbers. This is all to the end of 2019. This specific section estimates to the end of 2019. So this is kind of the obligatory map showing the deployment of community solar. And oftentimes with solar, what we see are these clusters. And so you see right away, there's big clusters of projects in Minnesota, Massachusetts, New York, Colorado, and a couple notable things with this. First, as is often the case with solar, it's not necessarily where the sun shines. The sun is much stronger in New Mexico than it is in Minnesota, but you have a lot of projects in Minnesota. So right away, this is an illustration of the role of policy, that essentially where there are policy, incentives, et cetera, you have more community solar deployment. The second notable thing about the map is that community solar does not necessarily track with other types of solar. So you think of, for example, California and Hawaii are the big rooftop solar markets, but not necessarily community solar markets. Places like Minnesota, it's just not, in the Southeast, for example, not huge rooftop solar markets, but really national leaders in community solar. Some of the really high level numbers, we estimate by the end of 2019, about 2,100 megawatts. So you can think about there's about 77 roughly 1,000 megawatts of solar in the United States. So it's a non-trivial chunk of that. It's something like 2%, 3% of all solar is in these community solar projects. We estimate that's spread across about 1,200 projects, and it's pretty broad geographic coverage, 39 states and Washington, D.C. So the majority of states have at least one community solar project. The key story with solar in general, and certainly the case with community solar, is rapid growth. Most years, community solar capacity doubles year over year. We estimate about 500 megawatts came online in 2019 alone. And there's essentially two reasons why community solar is growing so quickly, as summed up by these two figures. First, on the left, this illustrates the number of projects installed per year. So each little dot representing a new project, clearly the number of projects installed per year increasing over time, with roughly the same number installed from 2017 to 2018. But also those projects are getting larger. So this plot on the right illustrates the distributions of project capacity. So we see in the early years, the majority of projects were less than a megawatt, typically small scale, what most people think about when we talk about community solar. But recently, the median project has gotten much larger, and we see that there are at least a handful of projects that are more than 3-4 megawatts. So more projects and larger projects. Those two trends contribute to this rapid growth in community solar capacity. Consistent with the map that we just saw, there's a few key markets, and we can think of them as a few key states. And thinking in terms of states makes sense because oftentimes the supporting policy comes from the state level. So about 88% of all capacity is located in just 10 states. And just 2 of those states, Massachusetts and Minnesota, account for about half of cumulative community solar capacity. What's kind of interesting about the trends in geography and time is that there's these waves, these surges of deployment in specific markets. So just a few years ago, Colorado was kind of synonymous with community solar. It was a leading state in terms of capacity and number of projects. And so Colorado was kind of the original push. Minnesota was in the same policy time frame, but for a variety of reasons, the deployment there was a bit lagged. But Minnesota came on as the main leading state in community solar around 2016, and then in earnest 2017 through 2019. So that was kind of this new surge of projects in Minnesota. Similarly, Massachusetts came on as a major market around 2016. And then more recently, we see a handful of new states like Georgia and Florida. And then 2019, in a big way, New York became one of the major community solar markets. So we see these waves of community solar come into certain markets as policies unfold. And then finally, this is deployment by utility type. The majority, most of projects and capacity is in IOU, investor-owned utility territories. A lot of these are in programs like Excels in Minnesota and Colorado. These are policy-supported programs implemented by investor-owned utilities. So that's the lion's share of projects and capacity is by IOUs. However, cooperatives, publicly owned utilities, and municipal utilities have also embraced the community solar model in a big way. These projects tend to be much, much smaller, but there are a relatively large number of these projects, as illustrated here on the right, roughly 320 cooperative and municipal utility projects deployed across the country. So those are the high-level stats. So just to kind of summarize the big picture numbers to keep in mind, about 2 gigawatts of capacity by the end of 2019, roughly 2% of all solar capacity, rapid growth coming in waves through different markets, most of that capacity in a handful of states, and most of that capacity deployed by IOUs. And with that, I'll hand it back to Jenny.
Great, thanks, Eric. All right. So I'm going to talk about the market conditions that are enabling community solar and how our projects look across a variety of different market structures. First slide I have is looking at state policies across the U.S. Right now we have 20 states and Washington, D.C. that have some form of enabling legislation. So that can take a variety of forms. It might be a mandate for community solar that the utility offers community solar that may be subscribed through third parties or subscribed through the utility itself. In other states, we have enabling virtual net metering policies that allow third-party developers to come in and have a community solar project that allows for bill crediting through the utility. I should note that we have seen a couple movements in community solar legislation in this last year or two, but primarily they've been through states that already had a policy. There are some exceptions. We did see some expansion in Virginia, as well as Hawaii, some other states that are taking a lead on developing new policies. When we look at deployment by state, you do see that 71% of capacity and 81% of projects are located in states that do have some type of enabling legislation. Here we break out Colorado, Massachusetts, and Minnesota really as the leaders in terms of policy-enabled states. But it's not a prerequisite for community solar. So there are about 600 megawatts located in 22 states that do not have that enabling legislation. And that can be done through a utility, for example, that does not have a mandate to do community solar or does not offer the requisite metering structures, deciding that they want to develop a program on their own. One of our other questions when gathering all this data on community solar is how project sizes might impact deployment in the market. So we do have 15 states and DC that have a maximum size for their community solar projects. You can see there on the right in the solid orange bars what the project capacity limits are today. And we have had, you'll see in the orange with the white in the middle, that some states previously had lower limits and subsequently increased them. But essentially, you'll see that a lot of projects are, working with those project capacities, and that does have an impact on the total available size of the market. So we also have community solar programs that have caps themselves. So this is not related to the individual project, but how much community solar can be developed as part of a statewide or utility-wide program. We have 11 states that have some type of cap along those lines. We do see, though, however, that states generally have plenty of capacity left in those caps. In Massachusetts and New York, there are limits for the statewide incentives overall, but not specific to community solar. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at state potential is whether those capacity program caps are in play. So finally, I wanted to talk about anchor tenant rules. Anchor tenants are essentially large customers that take a significant portion of a community solar array. Might be, 30% of the array, 40%, things like that. One of the benefits of having an anchor tenant is that there is more revenue certainty for the project itself. The project developer or subscriber entity doesn't have to continually, resubscribe at the level they would if those were all smaller residential customers, for example. So while there are benefits and there might be, greater ability to finance a project, at the same time, having a large anchor tenant can crowd out other smaller subscribers. So there are some states that do limit the amount of capacity that can be held by anchor tenants. This is an area that we'd like to do more research in going forward, looking at really what are the impacts of those anchor tenant rules on financing projects, on project deployment, and other variables. So with that, I will turn it over to Gabe to talk to us about the subscriber value proposition.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabe Chan from the University of Minnesota. I'll be talking about some of our work to look at the subscriber value proposition. Essentially, what are the financial benefits to subscribers to community solar? So as part of our data collection, we sought to collect subscription contracts from projects. The subscription contracts are the agreement typically between the developer or owner of a project and the subscriber or off-taker. And that subscription contract provides the financial returns to the subscriber for a predefined share of the installation's energy output. So to do this data collection, we went utility by utility across the country looking for subscription contracts. We worked through utility websites and government filings to learn about offerings, and also went directly to developers, some of who shared contracts through NDA. In total, we looked at over 300 projects that we were able to find contracts for, and then built out a cash flow model to understand subscriber value. Particularly, what we were interested in was residential subscribers. And so we're looking at subscription contracts just for the projects for which we could find residential subscription contracts. For each contract, we then built a cash flow model that required a number of assumptions. We go through those assumptions in detail in the slide deck appendix, which will be available online after the webinar. But just to give you a sense, we looked at a few key factors building off of some available NREL tools. We also had to make some assumptions about degradation factors, retail rate escalation, and discount rates. We looked at a number of sensitivities. So in the next couple of slides, you'll see some ranges that represent taking into account these sensitivities. We also had to make a number of standard assumptions to look at contracts. One of the both findings and challenges of this project has been there's a lot of innovation and differences in subscription contracts. And so being able to fairly compare on an apples to apples basis contracts which are specified in very different ways required us to make a set of standardized assumptions. So we had to look at things like retail rates. And so we used the utility rate database and the EIA's data. For PV production, we used the system advisor model, and we had to make a number of sort of standard financial assumptions. And so there's a number of sensitivities. We performed that sensitivity analysis, as I mentioned, and we really took a lot of steps to try to put contracts on apples to apples basis. One of the really important innovations or differences to take into account with contracts are the subscription terms. So when we looked at contracts across all the projects, we found that upfront payments were the most common payment structure. Upfront payments, very straightforwardly, are when a subscriber pays an amount upfront and then receives returns over the life of the subscription contract. So we found that about 46%, nearly half of projects offered an upfront payment option. The next most common contract type was a monthly volumetric payment. So this was a payment per month based on energy output. We also saw monthly fixed payments as a common contract type, and also quite a bit of hybrid contract types. So these were blending together an upfront amount with a monthly amount, or various other types of hybrids. I'll also mention here is shown discount rates. About 8% of projects offer a fixed discount rate. And so this could take the form of either a fixed percent discount or a fixed kilowatt hour discount. And then you also see that about 15% of projects offered multiple subscription options, meaning that for a single project, there were different options for subscribers to choose from. So this could look like an upfront option or a more pay-as-you-go option. So taking these contracts together, our next step was to put them through the cash flow model. And so what we did was we ran each of these contracts through the cash flow model. And what's shown here is the distribution of the net present values for these contracts. So the median project has a positive NPV of 37 cents per watt. Running through the sensitivities I mentioned earlier, the range is 20 cents per watt to 46 cents per watt. Again, one of the challenges of putting contracts into apples to apples terms is that they're different sizes, meaning that some subscription contracts offer the opportunity to subscribe to, let's say, just a panel, and others were more pegged to historical consumption levels. So to give a rough sense, for a 5 kilowatt subscription, 37 cents per watt is equivalent to $1,850 in net present value terms. About 83% of the projects we looked at offered a positive NPV, meaning that most projects we looked at did provide a benefit to subscribers, a financial benefit. Over time, though, we looked at trends and see that actually NPVs are increasing over time. NPVs are trending upwards. In fact, the average NPV is positive from 2016 onwards. This is shown here by the year of interconnection for the project. And so looking at some of the previous slides that we showed about project development, as more projects have been developed, the NPVs have also been increasing over time. Finally, wanted to show a breakdown of the NPVs by both utility type and by state. There's quite a lot of difference here in the value created for subscribers. The value proposition depends on a number of things, the retail rate being one of the most important factors for subscriber value. But in general, what we see is that in the investor-owned utilities, which tends to be where policies are focused, there are higher NPVs for projects. Looking by state, that's higher in Minnesota and Massachusetts. Again, those are policy-driven states. And we see quite a large range, particularly in co-op projects, that really spans, from negative $4 per watt to positive $2 per watt, a really wide range in net present value to subscribers. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Jenny.
Great, thank you, Gabe. And just a reminder, we do have some questions rolling in, but go ahead and submit your questions in the question panel, and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. So I wanted to speak a little bit about going forward. We're going to talk about some of the market conditions as well as DOE and NREL activities that you might want to be engaged in. So one of the things we're looking at when we're tracking this market is which states have pending capacities or capacities we expect to come online. We call that capacity in the queue. There are various definitions of what that queue is, but for the most part, these are state policies that have had projects apply for an incentive or some other community solar treatment. So what you see in this figure is that we do expect a lot of capacity to come online in a small number of states. New York, Massachusetts, Minnesota, as well as Illinois, and a small bit in Colorado as well. One thing we're also tracking is the development of community solar in Florida. This came up as a question also already as to whether we would consider this Florida Power and Light program to be community solar. It is quite large. It's 1.5 gigawatts that were approved, and the project sizes themselves are, I think, around 70 megawatts. So quite large in terms of capacity. Some folks might consider those project sizes too large to be community, however you may define that. So that's one we're tracking, and those projects have not been developed yet, so they're not in our data anyway. So overall, we have about 2 gigawatts that are in those states pending capacities. I wanted to talk a little bit about our data and help we could use from folks on the line or listening to this recording later. We'd like to know if your project is missing. If you have a project in a state that was not highlighted, please let us know. If you're a developer, please let us know that you have a large pipeline of projects that are coming online in the next year or so. We do have folks who are sharing contract information, which Gabe has been analyzing. We're able to take in that information through an NDA if that is something that you would prefer. We also, as you've seen, only present aggregate data. So here's my contact information that you can use to contact me if you want to participate. And the last thing I wanted to highlight is the National Community Solar Partnership. This is a partnership that was launched by the Department of Energy and that NREL is supporting. It is focused on growing the community solar market across the country. We're trying to expand access to community solar across different geographies, and also expand access to all American households by 2025. So it is quite a large effort that combines general assistance and resources with a one-on-one technical assistance program, as well as individual efforts that are focused on developing community solar within municipal utilities, as well as on multifamily affordable housing buildings. We do have a partnership and way to register. So our community platform that we're using is called Mobilize, and we have 196 folks who are participating in this platform, and the link there is on the top. Folks can register at that link for the partnership. We do have you fill out a registration form that asks for some of your input about what you would like out of the partnership, and asks you to share some information about your organization and their goals for community solar. But we are hoping this platform will be kind of fun, innovative, interesting way to engage with other community solar stakeholders. So with that, we're going to turn it over to the Q&A section. We do have a number of questions that have started to come in, so thank you, everyone. I do not think we will not be able to get to them all today, but we will be answering as many as we can through the top of the hour. One thing, Gabe, I wanted to tee up to you is we had some questions come in about a little bit more information about the NPVs. If you could talk about different drivers of variation in the NPVs, or potentially if there are relationships between subscription model payments and NPVs, or other variables like that that you might be aware of.
Yeah, thanks. I think that when we looked at NPV, we built a cash flow model. That's a pretty straightforward cash flow model, looking at subscription payments and then revenue from the subscription. And in general, a subscription is pretty straightforward to analyze. I think one of the two main driving factors are the payments and the revenues. In general, the revenues are mostly tied to rates. I think in some previous work, NREL showed compensation either under virtual net metering or successor tariffs, such as Minnesota's value of solar. The subscription terms, though, vary quite substantially, and I'd say that some of the highest NPV subscription terms are offered in places where the compensation for a subscription allows for higher returns. And so we see that a lot of the contract design is very much tied to and driven by what the potential value for subscribers are. And so because from a developer standpoint, it's very important to fill out the subscriptions in order to secure financing for our project. We see that the subscriber value is very much driven by the compensation. And so looking at states that allow for higher compensation or utilities that enable higher compensation levels, we see more subscriber value possible there. So while there is a lot of innovation happening in the contract design, a lot of the big differences, the high-level differences, I think really depend on the compensation side.
Great, thank you. We also had a question come in talking about shares offered to low-income customers. I can speak to that a bit and would invite Gabe or Eric to chime in as well. The question was about identifying projects that offered shares to low-income customers. If so, how was that arranged? Were shares provided at a discount or other creative way to finance those shares? So NREL has been collecting data on low-income participation in community solar. There are policies and incentive programs in about 10 states that do provide some type of either mandate for developers to include community solar for low-income folks, or perhaps like an enhanced incentive for low-income participation. I may get the numbers not exactly right off the top of my head, but there are, I want to say, 10 to 20 megawatts of community solar that is subscribed by low-income customers across the country today through those incentives. And we also know that a lot of low-income customers are subscribing to like these fixed discount products where they are saving money from day one. And there may not be a specific incentive program in place for low-income community solar. Gabe or Eric, do you want to add anything on low-income participation?
Maybe I'll say that I think that for low-income participation, that there's a lot of activity at the state level, but I think also the ecosystem of support to build low-income participation is changing quite a bit, and we're seeing a lot of activity by focused developers and nonprofits to help support low-income subscriptions.
Great. Eric, I think you might be best able to answer this question about community choice aggregation. Question is about whether we've seen any CCAs finance their own community solar projects, and what are the barriers to CCA-driven community solar?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And again, off the top of my head, I believe that Marin Clean Energy, what is now called MCE in Marin, California, they have what we would consider a community solar product. And at least last year, there were murmurs of something like a community choice aggregation community solar product in New York. The barriers are community choice aggregation is already to some extent doing something comparable to community solar. So in order for it to really truly be community solar, it has to be an opt-in. There has to be a certain number of customers that say, we want to opt into this community solar model within some service. Whereas CCAs are really premised on this opt-out sort of structure. So it's unclear, especially the CCAs in California. I wouldn't say there are any barriers, but in some ways it's not entirely consistent with their goal. Their goal is essentially to increase the baseline amount of renewable energy, including solar, that they serve to all of their customers by default. Whereas community solar is about extending an option to certain customers for solar. So I don't know that there are any real barriers. It's more of just a definitional and kind of a purpose question, but it's happening, and there's no reason to believe that CCAs will not develop community solar in the future.
Great, thanks, Eric. Next question, Gabe, I think would be good for you to focus on projects developed by co-ops and municipalities. Could you explain why there's a greater negative NPV for co-ops and municipalities? The questioner thinks there might be a greater benefit for subscribers in those types of programs, since they might not be built by private developers needing a profit margin.
Yeah, happy to take that question. I think that with co-ops and munis, it's not just that there's a negative median, there's also a much wider range. And also many of those projects were developed earlier than the IOUs. But setting those two pieces aside, I think that one of the important considerations is that for co-ops and munis, many of these projects were developed voluntarily, mostly outside of policy, some inside policy, but many outside of policy. And typically the way we understand it is that these are offerings by consumer-owned utility, a co-op or a muni, to meet customer demand for more renewables. And oftentimes the thinking is how to build a project that recovers its costs so that there's no cross-subsidization. And so I think because of that, the avoided costs that go into the thinking of a community solar program in a co-op and muni are different than in an IOU. For an IOU, the compensation, the bill credits are really based on oftentimes something like a rider or a program using ratepayer revenues to sort of create the ability for bill credits. But in a co-op and muni, the thought process is a little bit different, and it's more driven by the utility in a way where the subscription can fully pay for itself internal to the project. And so the structures are different, and I think the range of considerations that a co-op and muni takes into account are quite different as well. And so we saw that in our analysis of contracts, some of the co-op and muni contracts were very heterogeneous. There's a lot of differences in those type of contracts, and a lot of interesting innovation going on there that created some challenges for us to analyze, but I think also represents that additional flexibility that many co-ops and munis have in designing community solar.
Great, thanks. I have a couple questions I think I can take. One is about a tool that might be available to help model community solar projects, such as the SAM model, which is the NREL's System Advisor model. So in the SAM model, you can model a community solar project itself, but the Department of Energy has also funded Elevate Energy to develop a community solar business case tool. And that tool essentially allows you to model different subscription compensation frameworks to understand really how to price your community solar project if you're a utility or a developer who is trying to figure out how to make a community solar business model work. So that tool is available, and it is a spreadsheet model based tool, so it's downloadable, and most of the fields, I believe, can be modified to fit your needs. They did a kind of case example using a project in Illinois, and then they have a general tool that can be customized for your state. So I'd encourage folks to check out that Elevate Energy tool. And then I also had a question about the National Community Solar Partnership Platform, talking more about how ideation and crowdsourcing might work on that platform. So essentially the platform is a little bit like a private social network. So once you join, you are able to make a post and say, hey, I'm working on this community solar project. I have questions about X, Y, and Z. Does anybody have a example of how they've solved that problem in the past? So you can make posts that would be available for everybody to see. You can also search the member database. So if you're looking for somebody in Massachusetts to talk to, you can search for folks who work in Massachusetts and then message them privately to get input on a certain thing related to your question on community solar. So that's how we're envisioning it. We're also, posting resources there and promoting webinars and things like that as well. So next question, maybe I will turn this to, maybe we'll start with Gabe, talking about renewable energy certificates and how our data collection includes that information. And maybe I would make it even broader and just say how state incentive programs might be treated as part of the net present value calculations.
Yeah, so for RECs, many, or renewable energy credits, many programs treat RECs in a way that gives optionality to the developer subscriber. I think that we began tracking that, and it became difficult to track because for several big programs, it was an option to keep the RECs or not, and it was difficult to determine whether or not people actually were. In the Minnesota experience that we know the best, or that I know the best, the REC treatment has changed over time, with initially this being an option where there was a payment, and then moving towards not having that option and the RECs being transferred to the utility by default. Unless the REC payment was part of the required compensation, we did not take that into account. But where it was, such as through an environmental value being part of the bill credit, we did take that into account. So we looked quite hard at what the bill credits were for each of the big programs to understand whether or not that payment followed with the subscription or not.
Great, thanks, Gabe. Eric, anything you want to chime in on related to RECs and incentives?
Not particularly, just maybe just doubling what Gabe said about thinking about co-ops. And when he was talking about policy support and a reason why policy supported programs often yield better returns, oftentimes that has to do with where the RECs go. If you subscribe to a program where the RECs go to utility, the utility effectively realizes a financial benefit from that. Not I wouldn't benefit per se, but it assists them in complying with their renewable portfolio standard. As a result of that benefit, they pass on a lower rate to the customer. That's the source of that savings. Whereas if you're subscribing to a community solar array without RECs, or where the RECs are transferred to the subscriber effectively bears that cost. But it also comes with this additional, it grants the user, the subscriber, the right to claim the use of renewable energy. And there are many people that are willing to pay that. So it's, and always you kind of get what you pay for. If there is a premium, oftentimes there is a reason for the added cost, and it may come with an additional benefit to the subscriber.
Great, thanks. Also got a question about common options when a community solar subscriber moves away. I can go ahead and take that one. Typically when subscribers move away, if they're moving within the utility service territory, they can usually transfer their subscription to their new residence. So that, is handled just by applying the bill credit to their new account. Some states and utilities have policies that say you can transfer your subscription to another subscriber, essentially, selling your interest in the subscription. And there are various ways that that can be handled. And some of it depends on whether you're subscribing through a third party or through the utility itself, as well as how the subscription is structured, right? Like if you paid $10,000 up front and then you move a year in, you're going to want to make sure you have a way to recoup some of that investment by selling your share to somebody else or selling it back to the utility. But there is quite a bit of variation in the nuance of how that's handled. Next up, we've gotten a question about Texas. That Eric, maybe I'll turn to you. So the person was wondering what approaches we're seeing for creating community solar programs in Texas utilities that have retail choice.
I don't know that I'm the best to answer that. I'm not familiar with anything specific to Texas. The only thing I could say generically is thinking about their retail choice and the supplier angle, that typically, as I showed, most community solar projects have been supported by utilities. We haven't really thought too much about how community solar programs could emerge from competitive suppliers. And so that's about as far as I will go there without speculating. And I don't know if you or Abe can add to the Texas specific piece.
Yeah, I could add a little bit about that. There are a few examples of REPs, retail electricity providers in Texas, developing community solar models. So this is happening. I think there are a small handful of REPs doing this. It's a difficult landscape because with a lot of retail choice, including retail providers that are offering green electricity already, community solar is seeing some challenges differentiating itself, but there is some of this development going on. And so we are tracking that in our database as well. And I think it is a really interesting set of cases to see how to innovate a community solar offering in the REP context. I should say also co-ops and munis in Texas are also developing community solar as well.
Great, thank you guys. We're also getting some questions on consolidated billing, about the percentage of projects with consolidated billing, whether we're tracking policies that require consolidated billing, things like that. I would say it has not been a focus of our data collection to date. We have been tracking policies that do look at consolidated billing. So, for example, the efforts in New York to require consolidated billing. And just, I guess, for background for folks, consolidated billing is where the local utility handles the payment for the community solar project as well as the credit, even though the project itself is operated by a third-party developer. So I would say, yeah, just generally we have seen, a couple states have interest in consolidated billing. We haven't gathered data on it to date, but that might be something we consider going forward. So what else? We have a few more questions related to just variation in success of community solar programs. Gabe, maybe you could talk about, factors that you have seen make a successful community solar program. We've seen obviously a lot of deployment in states like Minnesota, but there's also a question about states like Oregon that might have a mandate, but not a lot of deployment and a little bit of lag in terms of actually rolling out rulemaking.
Yeah, I think that looking at the market, I think Eric characterized some of the development over time nicely, and I think that one of the characteristics of markets that have had steady growth is stability. That because this is a very new segment of the solar market, one of the big challenges has been creating a stable investment climate, and also being able to use that stable investment climate to drive growth over multiple years. I think that one of the big challenges for community solar has been to clearly articulate the risks and the benefits of community solar, particularly upstream to investors and also downstream to subscribers. That community solar sits at this place where it's both a new product to many subscribers or residential customers, and also it's a new product for a lot of investors. And so being able to describe and understand and characterize risk very much directly to individual residential subscribers who maybe don't fully understand what this product is. And then also being able to communicate things like subscriber churn risk to investors, I think that's been the biggest challenge. And so having a stable environment that can enable that risk to be fully characterized and understood and drive sustained growth, I think is the big challenge. Great,
thank you, Gabe. I know we are approaching the top of the hour and we did have some technical difficulties, so I think I'll ask maybe one more question and then we'll go ahead and close things out. Just a reminder, we will have the recording and slides posted in the next couple weeks on the NREL Community Solar page. We thank you guys for participating and really appreciate your patience with our delays. So one last question, I think for Gabe, this would be the best, is a little bit more of an understanding of the assumptions for the net present value calculations. The question is looking at what interest rate we're assuming in those calculations. The questioner noted that rooftop installations pay for themselves over approximately 10 years and provide a reasonable IRR over their lifetime. Could we compare those rooftop installations with commercial installations?
Yeah, so for those interest rates, we've put that all into our slide deck. I believe that's in the assumption slide. We're looking at sort of a standard set of assumptions there, sort of between 4 to 8.5% is sort of our range that we're looking at sensitivity analysis. I think that comparison to rooftop is certainly feasible. I would say that there are some important considerations about the differences in those products. And I think depending on the decision frame and the context, the comparison to residential is very relevant, but I think also the comparison to utility scale is very relevant. I saw there was one question about that in the queue. And so those comparisons are certainly feasible. We thought that the clearest way to enable those comparisons for stakeholders for different purposes was to present a dollar per watt figure. But certainly other figures like an internal rate of return or a payback period can all be derived from the cash flow model and the dollar per watt figure. So certainly those kinds of calculations can be done, and I would just say that in different contexts, those comparisons may be more or less relevant.
Great, thank you, Gabe. So yeah, I wanted to say thank you to Gabe and Eric for presenting, for Harrison for keeping us on track with the technical issues, and to everybody for attending today. We will post the slides and recording to the Community Solar webpage on NREL's site. We will also post them to the National Community Solar Partnership online platform, and send out links to those resources as well. So thank you again, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.